Welcome to our channel, where exciting and inspiring stories come to life. Here, you will find stories of overcoming, surprising twists and lessons that touch the heart. We believe in the power of stories to transform perspectives. If you like good stories, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and activate the notification bell so you never miss our releases. And of course, share your opinions in the comments. We want to hear from you and how we can continue to bring you even more exciting stories.
Benjamin Hartman was the kind of man magazines loved to feature on their covers, a face that commanded attention, perfectly tailored suits, and a look of unwavering confidence. At 32, he had already carved out a spot on the lists of America's wealthiest young entrepreneurs, holding the title of vice president at Hartman Properties, a real estate empire he was set to inherit. His knack for transforming empty lots into luxury developments was undeniable, and so was his cold, calculated demeanor. Some admired him for his precision and business sense, but many saw him as little more than a corporate shark. That autumn, Benjamin traveled to Masonville, a small town on the Northern California coast where Hartman Properties planned to develop an exclusive condominium community for affluent buyers. To him, Masonville was just another on the map, and the project, just another way to bring in millions. Despite the town's beauty and tranquil air, he couldn't have cared less about the charm that drew tourists there. His mind was already on meetings, budgets, and timelines. After a long morning inspecting the property site, his chief engineer suggested stopping at a local diner, Charlie's, for lunch. Benjamin had intended to head to a reserved table at the town's most upscale restaurant, but he waved off his driver and opted for the diner. Perhaps it was the smell of fresh coffee and pancakes wafting through the open window, or maybe he just needed a change from the polished, uptight environment he was used to. Charlie's diner was exactly what he'd expect from a small-town eatery, cozy, filled with locals, and with an unpretentious warmth that seemed to contrast sharply with his own detached life. As he walked in, he noticed a group of elderly men playing cards in the corner, and a mother quietly entertaining her toddler at another table. He took a seat by the window, intending to get through his lunch quickly and quietly. But then, a young waitress approached his table, carrying a notepad in one hand and a coffee pot in the other. "Good afternoon, sir," she said, filling his cup without him asking. "Are you interested in today's special?" Benjamin looked up, caught off guard. The waitress had an easygoing, natural smile and eyes that sparkled with kindness. She wore a light blue apron, her brown hair pulled back in a loose ponytail, and even without makeup, she had a simple, unaffected beauty. "Yes," Benjamin replied, clearing his throat as he realized he'd been staring. "The special will be fine." The waitress jotted down his order, and as she turned to leave, he noticed her name embroidered on her apron, Sarah. He watched her walk back to the kitchen, interacting with the other patrons as if each one were a friend she'd known for years. There was an ease to her that Benjamin rarely saw in his own social circle, where almost everyone, including himself, seemed to be putting on an act. As he ate, he caught glimpses of her throughout the diner, refilling a coffee cup here, laughing with a couple there, helping a child who dropped his napkin. The way she treated people made him feel oddly aware of the distance he kept from others. Sarah had an aura of kindness and humility that filled the space, and for the first time in a long time, Benjamin felt like he wanted to get to know someone. When she came to clear his plate, he found himself saying, "Thank you, Sarah. Everything was perfect." She gave him a genuine smile and replied, "Glad to hear it. Not every day we get someone in here who looks like they're straight out of Wall Street." Her tone was playful, but she seemed curious. Benjamin chuckled, taken aback by her casual approach. "Wall Street, huh? You're not too far off. I'm here on business, actually. Real estate." "Oh, so you're involved in that new condo project? The one that's going to be built out by the lake?" Her smile faded slightly, and Benjamin noticed a flicker of worry in her eyes. "Yes, that's my company," he admitted, sensing a subtle shift in her mood. "Well," she said, choosing her words carefully. "I hope you're planning on keeping some of that beautiful land untouched. Masonville's small, but we take a lot of pride in our nature." Benjamin nodded, somewhat amused by her concern. He was used to people nodding along with his plans, not questioning them. "I'll keep that in mind." "Good," she replied, her smile returning. "We don't get many developers who care what the locals think." With that, she moved on to the next table, leaving Benjamin with a strange, lingering feeling. He'd had dozens of conversations with women in restaurants, at galas, and during business events, but none had ever intrigued him like this. Sarah was different, unassuming, sincere, and entirely uninterested in the status he wore like a badge of honor. Over the next few days, Benjamin found excuses to return to Charlie's diner. At first, he justified it to himself as needing a break from the endless business meetings, but deep down, he knew it was Sarah's presence that drew him back. She'd share little pieces of her life as she served him, growing up in Masonville, her love for the town, and her work at the diner to support her grandmother, who was unwell and lived with her. Each day, Benjamin found himself opening up to her too, surprising even himself. He told her about his travels, his childhood, and even his frustrations with the family business. Sarah listened intently, her eyes never wandering, as if his words truly mattered to her. It had been years since anyone looked at him that way. One chilly afternoon, as they chatted about the town's annual harvest festival, Sarah mentioned that she was helping organize it and invited him to attend. He accepted without hesitation. When the day arrived, Benjamin found himself walking through the festival's booths and games with Sarah, feeling a rare sense of relaxation and happiness. At the festival, he got to see more of her world. He met her friends, some of whom eyed him suspiciously, but Sarah brushed off their skepticism with a smile. She even convinced him to try his hand at a pumpkin toss game, which he played with an unusual lightheartedness that surprised him as much as anyone else. That night, as they sat on a bench overlooking the lake, the air filled with the crisp scent of pine, Benjamin realized he felt something he hadn't felt in years: peace. Sarah seemed to unlock parts of him that he'd kept hidden, and for once, he found himself not worrying about deals, investments, or what his parents would say. She brought him back to a place within himself he'd almost forgotten existed. "Thank you, Sarah," he said, his voice soft in the night, "for showing me this side of life." She smiled, looking out at the moonlit lake. "I think you've always had it in you, Benjamin. You just needed someone to remind you." As they sat in comfortable silence, Benjamin felt a deep certainty he couldn't ignore. He wanted Sarah to be a part of his life, permanently. For a man who had everything, he was startled to realize how much he needed someone like her, someone who could see him for who he was beneath the wealth and power. For the first time in his life, Benjamin Hartman knew he was falling in love. Benjamin Hartman had always prided himself on his ability to make clear-headed decisions. When it came to business, he was known for his shrewdness, for weighing risks and rewards with precision. But when it came to Sarah Moore, his instincts defied all logic. Their days together in Masonville became a steady rhythm. Benjamin found himself rearranging meetings and pushing back deadlines just to sit with her at the diner or walk by the lake in the evening. Masonville wasn't just a town to him anymore. It was the place where his carefully controlled life had unraveled in the best possible way. As they spent time together, Sarah's influence began to chip away at the tough exterior he'd built over years of chasing wealth and power. Her laugh, her honest opinions, her love for the town and for her family, they made him question everything he thought he wanted. And as the days turned into weeks, Benjamin realized he was no longer just passing through this small town. He wanted to stay. More than that, he wanted her by his side. One evening, after a quiet walk through the town square lit with Masonville's simple holiday lights, Benjamin found himself seated across from Sarah in the small diner that had become his second home. He looked at her, at the gentle warmth of her eyes, the quiet confidence she carried even in her simple clothes and easy smile. He felt a surge of something he hadn't felt in years, a sense of purpose that wasn't tied to success or numbers. "Sarah," he began, barely aware of the tremor in his voice. "I know we haven't known each other for long, but I know what I feel. You are everything I didn't know I needed in my life. You make me feel grounded, real, and like there's a reason to look beyond the numbers and deadlines." Sarah smiled, listening intently, though she seemed slightly bewildered by his sudden intensity. "I want you to come to New York with me," he continued. "Let's be together. You could move there, or we could travel together if you'd like. I could show you the world. She looked at him, searching his face for any sign of doubt. Benjamin, are you serious? Her voice was soft, hesitant. Absolutely. I know it's sudden, but I've never felt so sure of anything in my life. He reached across the table, taking her hand, hoping she would understand the sincerity behind his words. Sarah's eyes softened, but a shadow of worry passed over her expression. Benjamin, I don't know anything about that life. I love this town, my grandmother needs me, and, she hesitated, I've always been wary of change. I know it sounds like a lot, but I'm willing to be here as much as you need, he promised, his voice full of conviction. We'll figure it out together. A quiet, emotional pause filled the space between them. Finally, she nodded. If you're willing to meet me halfway, then yes. A soft, almost shy smile crossed her lips, and Benjamin felt his heart leap. The next few weeks were like a dream. The couple fell deeper in love, sharing conversations that stretched into the early hours of the morning. Sarah was cautious, but Benjamin's passion and dedication began to melt away her reservations. He spent countless hours in Masonville, showing her that he valued her world just as much as his own. Word spread quickly around town that Ben, the big city businessman, was serious about Sarah. Some of her friends teased her, unable to believe she had captured the heart of a millionaire. But others worried, reminding her of the dangers of falling in love with someone from such a different world. Sarah brushed off their concerns, choosing to believe in the Benjamin she had come to know, a man who was genuine, caring, and willing to put her happiness above his ambitions. Then came a moment that left Sarah completely stunned. On a clear December night, Benjamin asked her to accompany him on a quick trip to New York for a holiday weekend. Though hesitant, she agreed, wondering if she was ready for her first real look into his world. They dined at an upscale restaurant overlooking the lights of Manhattan, with holiday music playing softly in the background. The evening was magical, and Sarah felt her apprehensions start to fade as she saw how natural and easy Benjamin seemed, even in the glittering world of high society. Just when she thought the night couldn't be more perfect, Benjamin got down on one knee. Sarah, I didn't come here tonight to make this decision on a whim, he began, his voice filled with emotion. I've known for a while that you're the person I want to spend the rest of my life with. You make me see the world differently, you make me better, and I don't want to spend another day without you. He held up a ring, an exquisite understated piece that matched her style more than anything flashy or ostentatious. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth in shock, tears filling her eyes as she realized what was happening. Benjamin, she whispered, her voice trembling. Marry me, he said, looking into her eyes with a depth of sincerity she had rarely seen in him before. I want us to be together, in every way. Here in Masonville, wherever life takes us. I want you. In that moment, her doubts melted away. She said yes, and he slipped the ring onto her finger, sealing their promise with a gentle kiss. They were both swept up in the exhilaration of their love, and for the first time, Sarah felt she truly belonged in his world. News of their engagement reached his family and friends, and the reactions were swift and far from supportive. His mother, Diane, was livid. A socialite and old money heiress herself, she had groomed Benjamin from a young age to marry someone who could bolster their family's wealth and status. Sarah, a small-town waitress, was exactly the opposite of what she'd had in mind. One evening, Benjamin found himself at a family gathering, where his mother pulled him aside with a stern look. Benjamin, darling, you can't be serious about this girl. He sighed, bracing himself. Mother, her name is Sarah, and yes, I'm completely serious. Diane's expression was a mixture of disbelief and disappointment. Benjamin, think about what this could do to our family's reputation. You're a Hartman. This woman doesn't belong in our world. She doesn't understand what it means to be part of our legacy. It's not about status, Mother. It's about love. She's the best person I've ever met, and she's the person I want to spend my life with. His mother's eyes flashed with anger. And do you think she loves you for you, or for the money and luxury you offer? People like her, they can put on a sweet face, but when they see an opportunity, they'll take it. You're blind if you think otherwise. Benjamin felt a pang of frustration and hurt. He tried to brush off her comments, but her words planted a seed of doubt, however small, in his mind. Over the following days, he began noticing the subtle reactions of his friends, the quiet judgments and the glances they cast his way whenever Sarah's name came up. Even his best friend, Alec, whom he'd known since childhood, expressed concerns. Ben, I'm just saying you're a powerful guy and people They see a way up, Alec warned him over drinks one evening. Are you sure she's in this for you, and not just the life you're offering her? I know her, Alec. She's nothing like that. She didn't even want to leave Masonville for New York at first, he argued, trying to dismiss his friend's skepticism. But the doubts had taken root, quietly nagging at the back of his mind. Benjamin's heart was torn. He knew Sarah loved him for who he was, but under the weight of his family's scorn and his friends' suspicions, he couldn't shake the fear that maybe he was missing something. And as their wedding day approached, the pressure from his world and the loyalty to his family began to erode the certainty he'd felt with Sarah. Deep down, he struggled, caught between his love for her and his lifelong need to fit the role his family expected. And unbeknownst to Sarah, a storm was brewing, one that would soon put everything they had at risk. The days leading up to the wedding passed in a blur for Sarah. She was surrounded by the comforting hum of Masonville's small-town support, with friends from the diner and neighbors stopping by her house to offer congratulations and well wishes. Her grandmother, frail but full of life, often sat by the window, beaming with pride as she watched Sarah prepare for the biggest day of her life. There was a sense of wonder in the air, as though everyone in town felt as lucky as Sarah, knowing that one of their own was going to marry a man from such a different world, a man who seemed to adore her more than anything else. Benjamin, meanwhile, was back in New York, handling last-minute work obligations before the wedding. The ceremony was set to take place on a small, secluded beach on the coast, just outside Masonville. It would be an intimate affair, as Sarah wanted nothing grand or ostentatious, and Benjamin, for once, didn't push back. He agreed to keep it simple, almost as if he, too, were trying to hold on to the uncomplicated beauty of their love. But as the wedding day approached, Benjamin found himself besieged by doubts he had been trying to bury. His mother had become relentless in her opposition, finding subtle ways to remind him of what marrying Sarah could mean for the Hartman legacy. She didn't need to say it outright anymore. Her silences, her disappointed sighs, and the bitter comments from family friends who just couldn't believe he would go through with it were enough to leave him feeling cornered and isolated. Alec, his oldest friend, also continued to voice his concerns, even pulling him aside the night before he flew back to Masonville. Ben, this isn't some casual fling, Alec said, his expression serious. This is marriage. You're committing everything to her, your life, your fortune, your family's future. Are you absolutely certain she's the one? The word settled heavily in Benjamin's mind, feeding the insecurities that had been growing since his proposal. He was supposed to be sure, wasn't he? He thought he had been, but now, he couldn't be certain. The relentless barrage of doubt from the people closest to him made him question his own judgment. He spent that night in a sleepless fog, trying to remember the feeling he'd had when he first asked Sarah to marry him, the clarity he'd felt looking into her eyes. But under the pressure, that certainty was slipping away, like sand through his fingers. On the morning of the wedding, Benjamin boarded his private jet feeling like he was walking into a storm he couldn't see his way out of. His mind was a whirl of conflicting emotions, and by the time he arrived at the beach, he felt almost numb. The guests were few and close to Sarah, mostly family and friends from town. They sat in rows of white chairs set up in the sand, their faces filled with joy as they waited for the ceremony to begin. Benjamin stood at the makeshift altar, a simple arch adorned with wildflowers that Sarah's friends had woven together themselves. He glanced around, catching sight of his mother in the back row, her face an unreadable mask. Alec was beside her, his gaze dark and impassive. The whispers, the doubts, and the disdain he'd been absorbing for weeks now all pressed down on him at once, filling his chest with a suffocating weight. Then the music started, and everything seemed to fade. Sarah appeared, walking down the sandy aisle on the arm of her grandmother, her face lit with a happiness so pure that it took his breath away. She wore a simple dress, nothing extravagant, yet she looked radiant, her joy shining through as she locked eyes with him. In that moment, all the fear, the uncertainty, and the pressure melted away, and he felt as though he was seeing her for the first time again, the kind, humble woman who touched his heart in ways no one else ever had. But just as quickly as the feeling had come, the doubts flooded back. He could hear his mother's warnings, Alec's cautionary words, the whispers of his family's friends who wondered aloud if a woman like Sarah could ever understand what it meant to be part of the Hartman empire. He felt torn between two lives, the life of love and simplicity he craved with Sarah and the legacy, the expectations, the duty he was raised to uphold. The choice felt impossible, like tearing himself apart, no matter which path he chose. With each step Sarah took closer, Benjamin's heart raced faster, his palms grew damp, and an unshakable dread gripped him. He couldn't do this. He couldn't just abandon his family, his responsibilities, everything he'd spent his life building. He knew the cost of walking away from her now, but he was too weak to face the cost of losing the approval of his family, his friends, the world he'd spent his life proving himself to. Just as she reached him, holding out her hands with a smile that could melt any heart, he took a step back. The words caught in his throat, but he forced them out. I can't do this, he whispered, barely audible. Sarah's smile faltered, confusion flickering in her eyes. What are you saying? He looked down, unable to meet her gaze, shame and fear clawing at him. I'm sorry, Sarah. I can't marry you. The silence that followed was heavy, stretching endlessly between them. Sarah's hand fell to her side, her face crumbling as she tried to make sense of his words. The guests murmured, their surprise turning to shock as they realized what was happening. Sarah's grandmother gasped, clutching her hand to her chest, while her friends stood frozen, their faces etched with horror. Why? Sarah's voice was barely a whisper, her eyes filling with tears. What changed? He couldn't answer. How could he explain the twisted logic of his decision, the cowardice that drove him to this moment? He mumbled a broken apology, his voice hollow, then turned and walked away, his heart feeling as though it was shattering with every step. The whispers and murmurs of the guests followed him, growing louder as he moved, but he kept walking, too ashamed to look back. Once he reached his car, he sat behind the wheel, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. He could hear Sarah's voice in his mind, see the betrayal in her eyes, and he knew he'd done something unforgivable. He had thrown away the one good true thing he had ever known. He felt a painful emptiness settle over him as he drove away, the weight of his choice pressing down on him like a stone. As he pulled onto the main road, he took one last look in the rearview mirror, catching a glimpse of the beach in the distance, now a blur through the tears he didn't realize he'd shed. He knew, even then, that he would regret this decision for the rest of his life. But he couldn't bring himself to go back. Not now. Not after what he'd done. For Sarah, it was as though her entire world had shattered in a single moment. The love she thought would last forever had slipped through her fingers, leaving her standing alone, humiliated, and heartbroken. She watched as the man she thought she knew, the man she loved, disappeared down the road, carrying with him every dream, every promise, every piece of her heart. In the weeks that followed, the quiet town of Masonville buzzed with the fallout of the broken wedding. Sarah retreated into herself, shutting out everyone who tried to console her. She threw herself into work, trying to escape the memories that haunted her, but the pain remained. And though she would eventually rebuild her life, the wound of that day would never fully heal. For Benjamin, life resumed in New York, but he was a shell of the man he had been. Though he tried to drown his guilt in work and distractions, nothing filled the emptiness left by Sarah's absence. In the back of his mind, he knew he had made the wrong choice. But by then, the damage was done, and he would have to live with the consequences of his betrayal, hoping that someday, he could find a way to forgive himself. The days that followed her abandoned wedding felt like a surreal nightmare for Sarah. She wandered around Masonville, the town that had once been her sanctuary, feeling utterly exposed. She'd gone from being a beloved figure in the community to a cautionary tale, the girl who'd been left at the altar by a rich man from another world. Her friends and neighbors offered her sympathy, but she could see the pity in their eyes, which only deepened her humiliation. For weeks, Sarah could barely bring herself to step outside. She holed up in her small, modest home, watching as the days passed like scenes from a life she no longer belonged to. The memories of Benjamin haunted her every thought, his laughter, his promises, the love she'd believed was real. She replayed every moment, every conversation, searching for signs that she'd missed, clues that could explain why he'd left her so heartlessly on the day she thought would be the happiest of her life. But there were no answers, only an aching emptiness that seemed to grow with each passing day. As the weeks turned into months, Sarah knew she couldn't live in isolation forever. Her grandmother, who had watched her heart break along with her own, gently encouraged her to start moving forward. "You're stronger than this, my dear," she would say softly. "Pain like this doesn't go away, but you'll find a way to live with it. You always do." Taking her grandmother's words to heart, Sarah decided to channel her hurt and heartbreak into something constructive. She threw herself into her work at the diner, taking on more shifts and helping with everything from inventory to cooking. She worked harder than she ever had before, hoping that by staying busy, she could somehow bury the memories that haunted her. The work was grueling, but the small achievements helped her regain a sense of control, a feeling that she could rely on herself, even if no one else would. After a while, the owner of Charlie's Diner, an elderly man named Charlie who had run the place for decades, noticed Sarah's dedication and the positive impact she had on both the staff and customers. One afternoon, as they closed up, he approached her with a thoughtful expression. "Sarah," he began, his voice as gentle as always, "I've been thinking. I'm getting old, and the diner needs someone with passion and drive to keep it going. I think you're that person." The proposal caught her off guard. She was only a waitress, an employee who'd never even dreamed of owning anything like a business. But Charlie insisted, explaining that he trusted her to carry on his legacy, that she had the heart and determination to make the diner more than it had ever been. After some thought, Sarah agreed to his offer, grateful for the opportunity to focus on something new, something she could call her own. Owning the diner brought Sarah a renewed sense of purpose. She poured herself into revamping the menu, creating a cozy, welcoming atmosphere, and hosting events that brought the community together. She added her grandmother's recipes to the menu, and soon enough, the diner became a beloved spot not only for locals but for tourists as well. People came from nearby towns to taste the dishes that had become her grandmother's legacy, and the diner's reputation grew far beyond what anyone in Masonville had imagined. With every success, Sarah began to reclaim a part of herself she had lost. She stopped thinking of Benjamin, stopped wondering what she could have done differently, and started focusing on building a life of her own, one filled with pride and independence. Her pain became the fuel that drove her to succeed, and as the years passed, her small business expanded, growing into a chain of diners across the state. The woman who had once been defined by heartbreak was now known as a savvy entrepreneur, a strong woman who had taken control of her own destiny. But though her life seemed full on the surface, Sarah couldn't deny the scars left by Benjamin's betrayal. She had become stronger, yes, but the shadow of that lost love lingered. The people who had once pitted her now admired her resilience, and though she appreciated their admiration, she sometimes wondered if they could see past the facade to the part of her that was still healing. Meanwhile, in New York, Benjamin's life had taken a different turn. On the surface, he had everything he'd ever wanted: the prestige, the money, the success that made him a fixture in high society. His family and friends seemed pleased, relieved that he'd come to his senses and hadn't married someone they deemed unsuitable. But the victory felt hollow, like a performance he was forced to enact each day. Benjamin tried to convince himself he'd made the right choice. He threw himself into his work, focusing on expanding Hartman Properties and maintaining the legacy his family had built. But every success was tainted by the memory of Sarah. No amount of accolades or deals could erase the image of her face on that beach, the hurt in her eyes as he walked away. He'd sacrificed her for the approval of his family, but the guilt gnawed at him, turning his achievements into ash. In quieter moments, alone in his penthouse apartment or during sleepless nights, he would think of her. He wondered what her life was like, if she was happy, if she'd ever forgiven him. He'd heard snippets here and there about the success of her diner, how it had become a popular spot in Masonville and beyond. Part of him wanted to reach out, to apologize, to beg her forgiveness, but he knew it would be selfish to do so. He had made his choice, and there was no way he could undo the damage he had caused. Years passed, and Benjamin's regret deepened with each one. His relationships were shallow, his friendships built on convenience and power rather than trust or genuine connection. Though he occasionally dated women from his social circle, he always found himself comparing them to Sarah, to the warmth and authenticity she had brought into his life. No one else could measure up to what he'd had with her, and the emptiness he felt became a constant companion. One evening, after yet another grueling day at the office, Benjamin found himself alone in his apartment, a glass of whiskey in hand as he stared out at the city skyline. The lights of Manhattan glittered below him, but they felt cold, distant, and meaningless. He thought back to Masonville, to the quiet nights by the lake with Sarah, to the peace he had once felt in her presence. For the first time, he realized the price he had paid for his ambition. He traded love for success, but the success felt hollow without her. In a moment of desperation, he opened his laptop and searched her name. To his surprise, news articles and features about her success filled the screen. She was no longer the small-town waitress he'd fallen in love with. She was a respected businesswoman, a local icon whose diners had become famous for their charm and warmth. As he read through the articles, pride and sadness mingled within him. She had become everything he'd always known she could be, but she'd done it without him. As he scrolled through images of her at various events, standing beside employees, smiling with customers, he felt an overwhelming urge to see her again. He knew it was wrong, knew it was far too late to make amends. But he couldn't escape the feeling that he needed to try, if only to look her in the eyes one last time and acknowledge the pain he had caused. Benjamin didn't know if she would even agree to see him, or if she would slam the door in his face. But he was willing to take the risk. He had spent years trying to bury his guilt, to tell himself he'd made the right choice. But now, standing alone in the silence of his apartment, he knew the truth. He had made a terrible mistake, and he would never be whole until he faced the woman he had left behind. With a shaky breath, he picked up his phone and made arrangements to travel to Masonville, the place where he'd left his heart and lost his soul. He didn't know what he would find, but he knew he had to try, if only to say the words he'd been carrying in his heart all these years. The late afternoon sun bathed Masonville in a golden glow as Benjamin drove down the familiar winding roads that led to the town. The place hadn't changed much in the year since he'd left, and with each mile memories surfaced. Memories of simple nights at the diner, quiet conversations by the lake, and the love he'd lost through his own cowardice. As he entered the town, he felt a mix of nervousness and anticipation. He hadn't told Sarah he was coming, unsure if she would even want to see him. Part of him knew that just showing up like this was selfish, that he was dredging up a past she'd likely moved on from. But he couldn't help himself. The years of regret had only sharpened his longing for closure, and he needed to face her, to tell her he was sorry, even if it changed nothing. Benjamin had done his research before coming. He knew that Sarah's diner had expanded into a local chain, now with 4 locations across the state, each thriving with a reputation for warmth, comfort, and unforgettable food. Her success was well documented, with articles that praised her resilience and business savvy. She had transformed her pain into something beautiful, something lasting. In every photograph he'd seen of her, she looked confident, radiant, and fulfilled. It made him proud and filled him with a bittersweet ache. She had become everything he knew she could be, without him. As he pulled up in front of the original location of Charlie's Diner, now rebranded as Sarah's Place, he felt a lump form in his throat. The diner looked almost the same, with its bright blue awning and hand-painted sign. It was busy, with locals and visitors alike chatting and laughing as they waited for tables or picked up to-go orders. He took a deep breath, realizing he was standing on the threshold of a place that had once felt like home. Stepping inside, he was immediately hit by the smell of fresh coffee and warm pastries. The decor was inviting, a mix of rustic and modern, with photos of the town's history on the walls and small, personal touches that he recognized as Sarah's. As he stood near the door, feeling out of place in his tailored suit amidst the cozy atmosphere, a young waitress greeted him. "Welcome to Sarah's Place. Table for one," she asked with a friendly smile. He hesitated, suddenly unsure of what he was doing there. I was wondering if Sarah is in today," he asked, his voice barely a whisper. The waitress raised her eyebrows, surprised, but nodded. "Oh, she's here. She's in the back office, but she usually comes out to greet customers. Can I tell her who's asking?" He swallowed, feeling the weight of his own cowardice returning. He wanted to bolt, but he forced himself to answer. "Yes, please. Tell her Benjamin Hartman is here." The waitress's eyes widened slightly, as if she recognized his name, but she didn't say anything. She nodded and headed to the back, leaving Benjamin alone to brace himself for what was about to happen. Moments later, he saw her. Sarah emerged from the back of the diner, her hair pulled back in a loose ponytail, dressed in a simple blouse and jeans. Her face had matured slightly, with a poise and strength that hadn't been there before. She looked at him, and for a split second, he saw the flash of recognition and shock in her eyes. But almost immediately, her expression hardened, and she walked toward him with a calmness that made his heart pound. "Benjamin," she said, her tone cool and controlled. "I didn't expect to see you here." He struggled to find the right words, thrown off by the resolve in her voice. "Sarah, I know I should have called, but I needed to see you. I needed to apologize." She crossed her arms, studying him with a look that was unreadable. "Apologize? For what, exactly?" He felt the weight of her question, realizing she deserved more than the simple answer he'd prepared. "For everything," he began, his voice breaking slightly. "For walking away, for hurting you, for all the pain I caused." Her gaze remained steady, unyielding. "You think you can just come here, years later, and apologize? Do you think that makes up for what you did?" He swallowed hard, feeling the sting of her words. "I know it doesn't. I don't expect it to. I couldn't live with myself, knowing I never faced you. I needed to tell you how sorry I am. I was a coward. I chose my family's approval over you, and it's the biggest regret of my life." Sarah's expression softened, but only slightly. "You left me, Benjamin. You didn't just break my heart, You humiliated me. You made me feel like I was worthless, like I was never good enough for you or your world. He dropped his gaze, feeling the full weight of his actions. I know. And there's nothing I can say to make it right. But Sarah, I need you to know that I haven't had a single day of peace since that moment. I thought I was making the right choice for my family, for my reputation, but I was wrong. I've been wrong ever since. She looked at him in silence, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and resilience. You were right about one thing, Benjamin. I didn't belong in your world. But I made a world of my own, and I'm proud of it. I built something from the ground up, with the pieces you left behind. I didn't need you to save me, I saved myself. The words struck him like a blow, yet there was a part of him that was glad to hear her say it. She had risen from the ashes of their broken love, stronger and more formidable than ever. And she was right, she didn't need him, not then, not now. I see that, Sarah. I see everything you've built, and I'm so proud of you, he said softly, genuine admiration in his voice. You've become everything I always knew you could be. She nodded, her eyes softening just a little. Thank you, Benjamin. I didn't need you to tell me that, but, thank you. He took a deep breath, gathering his courage. Is there any way I could make it up to you? Even if it's just as a friend? She shook her head, her expression resolute. No, Benjamin. You can't undo the past, and I don't need you to make anything up to me. I moved on. I'm happy, and I don't need you in my life to be complete. Her words were final, and he felt a hollow ache settle in his chest. He had hoped foolishly that perhaps he could rebuild something with her, even if just as friends. But he realized now that he was clinging to a ghost, a memory of a life he'd thrown away. He nodded, trying to hold back the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. I understand. I just needed to say it. To look you in the eyes and tell you that I was wrong. That I've missed you, and I'll always regret losing you. She met his gaze, a faint trace of sympathy flickering in her eyes. I'm glad you found the courage to face me, Benjamin. But I've built a life for myself, one that doesn't include you. I hope you can find peace too. With that, she turned and walked away, leaving him standing alone in the diner, surrounded by the warmth and life she had created. He watched her disappear into the back, the finality of her departure sinking into him. This was the end, the last chapter of the story he had clung to for so long. As he left the diner, Benjamin felt a strange mix of relief and sorrow. He had finally said the words he'd held onto for so many years, and though they hadn't changed anything, he felt a quiet release, as though he could finally let her go. Walking away from Masonville, he knew he would carry the weight of his mistake for the rest of his life. But he also knew that Sarah had found her own happiness, her own strength. And for that, he was grateful. Months had passed since Benjamin's return to Masonville. Life had moved on, and for Sarah, the encounter with him at the diner had brought a sense of closure she hadn't realized she needed. She found herself more at peace than ever, even happier in the life she had built. The weight of their past, once a painful shadow over her, felt lighter now, almost like a distant memory. Sarah continued to dedicate herself to her diners, which had become more successful than she'd ever dreamed. Her reputation as a savvy, compassionate entrepreneur grew, and she had recently opened a 5th location in a neighboring state. With each milestone, she felt an immense sense of fulfillment, one that was truly her own. It was a life she had built with her own strength, her own vision, and the support of her beloved community. But more than her career, Sarah had found joy in the simpler things. Quiet evenings spent with friends, afternoons visiting her grandmother, walks by the lake that once held bittersweet memories but now felt like a place of healing. She had even started dating again, and though she was cautious, she felt ready to open her heart to someone new. She knew that love, real love, would come to her when the time was right, and this time, it would be with someone who embraced her entirely, just as she was. For Benjamin, life had taken a different turn. Returning to New York after his visit to Masonville, he realized the empty facade of the world he'd once dedicated his life to maintaining. The company he once poured himself into now felt like a weight around his shoulders, a monument to the life he'd chosen over Sarah and the happiness he'd lost. He could still feel the sting of her rejection, but it had also given him a clarity he hadn't felt in years. He knew he couldn't go on living as if nothing had changed. In the months that followed, Benjamin made drastic changes. He stepped down from his role as vice president, shocking his family and the business world. He decided to travel, to leave the pressures and expectations behind, and to search for something that would finally bring him peace. He knew he couldn't erase his regrets, but he was determined to live a life he could be proud of, a life based on his values, not those of others. His journey took him through small towns and quiet places, far from the luxury and noise of the city. He spent time working on community projects, helping to restore old buildings, and even teaching business workshops to young entrepreneurs. In these places, he found the simple joy he'd once felt with Sarah, a life filled with purpose and honesty. Though he still carried the memory of their love, he found a way to turn his regret into something meaningful. And while he knew he would always wonder what might have been, he no longer felt trapped by the choices he'd made. One summer, almost 3 years after their last encounter, Benjamin received a postcard from Masonville. It was from an old friend who had attended Sarah's wedding. She had married a local man, a kind-hearted, supportive partner who shared her values. The postcard was simple, with a photo of the lake they had once walked by together, but it filled him with an unexpected warmth. Benjamin stared at the postcard for a long time, a bittersweet smile on his face. Though he'd known deep down that Sarah would eventually find happiness, the news felt like both a finality and a gentle blessing. She had moved on, truly and completely, just as he had hoped. And knowing that gave him a sense of closure he hadn't known he needed. He placed the postcard in his journal, a quiet reminder of the life and love he had left behind, and continued on his own path. He knew he might never find love quite like what he'd had with Sarah, but he was at peace with that. He was living a life of integrity and kindness, a life that honored the lessons she had taught him without ever knowing. As Benjamin looked out over the small coastal town he had come to call home, he felt a quiet sense of joy, a feeling that maybe, after all the mistakes and regrets, he was finally where he was meant to be. Thank you so much for watching this story. I hope you enjoyed following Benjamin and Sarah's journey of love, regret, and renewal. Don't forget to like this video if you found it touching, and please subscribe to the channel for more stories just like this. If you're ready for more, make sure to check out the other videos appearing on your screen now. There's a lot more heartwarming content waiting for you. Thanks again, and we'll see you in the next story.